The hull groaned like a living thing. Deep beneath the waterline of the SS Marine Raven, a Liberty ship never meant to carry human cargo, 150 German women counted hours in the dark. It was February 1945, and the North Atlantic showed no mercy. Each roll of the vessel sent bodies sliding against cold riveted steel. The air tasted of rust, brine, and vomit, a combination that had long since stopped being nauseating and had simply become the atmosphere of their confinement. Greta Hoffmann pressed her back against the bulkhead and closed her eyes, though darkness made little difference. 23 years old, formerly a Luftwaffenhelferin stationed outside Aachen, she had spent the last 9 months plotting aircraft movements on a radar screen in a concrete bunker. Her hands, once steady enough to mark enemy bomber formations with precision, now trembled constantly. The trembling had started 3 weeks ago when American soldiers stormed their facility, not with the brutality she'd been promised, but with an efficiency that was somehow more terrifying. They'd simply walked in, weapons raised but not firing, and said one word in fractured German: Raus. Around her, women whispered in the gloom. Marta, a telephone operator from Hamburg, recited poetry to herself, the same Goethe verses over and over until they lost all meaning. Liesel, who'd manned an anti-aircraft battery outside Stuttgart, sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. She hadn't spoken since boarding. The youngest among them, a girl named Anna who couldn't have been more than 18, clutched a photograph so worn the faces had nearly rubbed away. Mother, father, brother, all three still rubbed away. Mother, father, brother, all three still in Germany, somewhere beneath the Allied bombing campaign that continued to reduce cities to memory. The propaganda had been explicit, clear, unambiguous. Americans tortured their prisoners. They starved them. They violated the women and executed the men. Greta had sat through the briefings in 1943, watching grainy footage that purported to show American atrocities, listening to officers describe the savage nature of the Western enemy. The message was consistent. Capture meant death, only slower and more humiliating than an honest bullet. Better to fight. Better to die with a weapon in hand than submit to what awaited in enemy custody. Yet here she was. Alive. Unfed, yes. The rations aboard the Liberty ship consisted of watery soup and hard bread, but alive. Unmolested. The American guards who'd accompanied them to the port had been almost disturbingly professional, directing them into trucks with the bored efficiency of men moving furniture. One had even helped an older woman, Frau Kirchner, a communications supervisor in her 40s, climb into the transport when her arthritic knee had buckled. He'd done it without comment, without drama, as if helping the enemy were simply procedure. The inconsistency gnawed at Greta worse than hunger. Propaganda wasn't supposed to lie, not fundamentally. It exaggerated, certainly. It simplified. But the core narrative had to hold some truth, or the entire structure of belief collapsed. She'd grown up in Heidelberg, studied mathematics at university for 2 years before the war swallowed everything, and she'd been raised to trust in logic, in cause and effect. The Americans were the enemy. The enemy was brutal. Therefore, Americans must be brutal. The syllogism should have held. Above deck, sailors shouted to one another. The ship heaved starboard, and several women gasped as cargo shifted somewhere in the forward hold. U-boats still prowled these waters, that much everyone knew. The crossing took weeks, and every hour stretched into an eternity of waiting for the torpedo that would send them to the ocean floor. Greta found herself calculating survival odds, a mathematician's habit even in circumstances that defied calculation. Water temperature, perhaps 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time, 15 minutes, maybe 20 for the younger, stronger women. Number of lifeboats, insufficient. Probability of rescue, negligible. Do you think it's true? Marta's voice cut through the mechanical symphony of groaning metal and sloshing bilge water. What they told us about America? No one answered immediately. The question hung in the fetid air, dangerous in its implications. To doubt the briefings was to doubt the Reich itself, and even here, even as prisoners being transported across an ocean toward an unknown fate, such doubt felt like treason. Old habits died hard. Old fears died harder. My cousin went to New York in 1937, Liesl said suddenly. Her first words in 3 weeks. She wrote letters. Said it was clean. Said people had automobiles. Said there was food in every shop, more than you could imagine. She paused. They made her stop writing. Said she was spreading defeatist propaganda. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Heavier, pregnant with implications none of them wanted to examine. Greta thought of her brother Klaus, a Wehrmacht corporal last seen retreating east through Poland. The Soviets were there now. She'd heard rumors before the capture, whispers among the auxiliaries about what happened to German soldiers taken by the Russians. Forced labor, starvation, death marches into Siberia. If those rumors were true, and some animal instinct told her they were, then the Americans transporting them in a cargo ship with inadequate rations but no beatings, no executions, no violations were the gentle captors. The realization settled over her like ash from a distant fire, suffocating in its quiet completeness. If the Americans were the merciful enemy, what did that make the war she'd served? What did that make the cause she'd believed in? The ship rolled again. Somewhere in the dark, Anna began to cry, soft and hopeless. Greta kept counting hours until landfall, knowing that the real shock wouldn't be the crossing. It would be the arrival, and whatever truth waited on the other side of all that propaganda. The first thing Greta saw was color. Not the gray-green monotony of the Atlantic or the rust-stained steel of their floating prison, but actual, vivid color, red brick buildings along the harbor, painted signs in garish yellow and blue. Even the uniforms of the American soldiers waiting on the dock carried a richness of hue that seemed obscene after weeks of deprivation. The Marine Raven groaned against its moorings, and 150 women stumbled onto American soil with all the grace of newborn foals, legs betraying them after so long at sea. An American officer stood at the gangway, clipboard in hand, face displaying the particular kind of boredom that comes from repetitive duty. He didn't look at them with hatred. He didn't look at them with lust. He barely looked at them at all, simply gestured them toward a line of waiting trucks with the weary efficiency of a man who'd processed 1,000 prisoners before and would process 1,000 more. Greta found this somehow more disorienting than violence would have been. Where was Where was the sneering contempt? Where was the promised brutality? "Move along, ladies," a younger soldier said in heavily accented German. "Transport's waiting. No dawdling." Frau Kirchner stumbled, and the same soldier reached out to steady her. An instinctive gesture, thoughtless. He released her immediately, as if suddenly aware of the impropriety, but the damage was done. Greta watched the older woman's face crumple with confusion. The enemy wasn't supposed to catch you when you fell. The trucks rumbled west for hours, through countryside so untouched by war it seemed like a fever dream. No bomb craters. No burned-out tanks decorating the roadside like grotesque monument. No refugees streaming endlessly toward some imagined safety. Just farms, intact and productive, cattle grazing in fields that hadn't been scorched or mined or fought over. Anna pressed her face against the truck's canvas opening, staring at a scene that might as well have been from another planet. In Germany, the landscape had become a vocabulary of destruction, every city a dialect of rubble, every road a text written in blood and ash. Here, a barn stood complete, its paint fresh, its doors closed against nothing more threatening than weather. They arrived at the camp in Texas, Fort Sam Houston, though none of them knew the name yet, as dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a prison. The gates opened. They filed through. And then the second shock arrived, compound and overwhelming. The barracks had windows. Real windows with glass intact, not the shattered, boarded-up gaps they'd grown accustomed to in Germany. Inside, rows of beds, actual beds with mattresses and blankets, not straw pallets on concrete floors. Not straw pallets on concrete floors. A woman in a Red Cross uniform stood near the entrance, arms full of folded towels, speaking in careful German about showers and meal times and medical examinations. Showers. The word hung in the air like a promise too dangerous to believe. Greta set her small bundle of possessions on the nearest bed and simply stood there, paralyzed by the disconnect between expectation and reality. Marta moved through the barracks, touching everything, fingers trailing across wood and fabric as if confirming their solidity. Liesel found a faucet and turned it experimentally. Water flowed, clear, clean water that didn't need to be boiled or rationed or fought over. She let it run for a full minute, mesmerized, before guilt forced her to shut it off. Dinner arrived an hour later, served on metal trays by German prisoners who'd been here longer, men who'd been captured in North Africa or Italy and who moved with the casual comfort of people who'd grown accustomed to captivity. The portions were measured, regulated by Geneva Convention standards, but those standards exceeded what German civilians had seen in months. Potatoes, bread with actual texture, some kind of meat in gravy. Nothing fancy, nothing luxurious, but sufficient. Deliberately, mathematically sufficient. "They're fattening us up," whispered a woman named Helga, suspicion hardening her features. "Before whatever comes next." But nothing came next. Not that night. Not the day after. No interrogations beyond basic processing. No torture chambers. No casual cruelties. Just the strange, numbing routine of a well-organized POW facility operating exactly according to international law. They were assigned numbers, photographed, given uniforms. A doctor, an actual physician, not some brutal experimenter from propaganda films, examined them with clinical detachment, prescribed medications for the various ailments the Atlantic crossing had aggravated, and moved on to the next patient. Greta lay awake that first night, listening to the breathing of 149 other women, all of them grappling with the same cognitive dissonance. Through the window, she could see guard towers silhouetted against a sky absolutely thick with stars, unpolluted by blackout curtains or searchlights or the glow of distant fires. The guards in those towers were armed, certainly. They were prisoners, undeniably. But the bars of this cage were so much more comfortable than anything she'd experienced in the last year of serving the Reich that the distinction between captor and protector had begun to blur. The propaganda had prepared them for degradation, for starvation, for abuse that would make martyrs of them, victims whose suffering would justify whatever the Reich had done in their name. But this bureaucratic competence, this adherence to rules, this fundamental decency even in imprisonment, this was more dangerous than any torture because it couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be heroically endured, couldn't be woven into a narrative of German victimhood. Beside her, Anna clutched that worn photograph and whispered prayers for her family still in Hamburg. And Greta realized, with the slow horror of truth arriving, that the real cruelty was just beginning, not here in this clean barracks with its running water and adequate rations, but in the knowing, in the comparison, in the dawning, terrible awareness that if this was how the enemy treated their prisoners, what did that suggest about the side she'd served? The letters arrived on a Thursday in April, distributed by a tight-lipped American sergeant who seemed to understand the weight of what he carried. Thin envelopes, paper so poor it was nearly transparent, covered in cramped handwriting that spoke of ink conserved and space rationed. Greta watched women lunge for them with desperate hunger, names called out echoing through the Texas barracks like a liturgy of longing. Some received nothing. They sat silent, faces carefully blank, pretending the emptiness didn't hollow them out from the inside. Greta's letter came from her mother in Heidelberg. The handwriting was familiar, but something in the slant of the words suggested a tremor that hadn't been there before. She carried it outside, away from the collective grief and joy of the mail call, and sat beneath a tree that had no business existing in a prison camp. The paper crackled as she unfolded it. 3 pages, front and back, written so small her mother must have needed a magnifying glass. "My dearest Greta," it began, and then the world her mother described bore no resemblance to the city she'd left. The university was rubble. Their street existed only in memory. The neighbors, the Goldsteins who'd disappeared in 1938, the Mullers who'd hosted summer garden parties, the widow Hoffman who'd taught piano, all gone, though her mother didn't specify whether gone meant fled or dead or simply vanished into the chaos of total war. Food came through ration cards that promised more than they delivered. People ate potato peels. They burned furniture for warmth. The Americans had bombed in March, and her mother had spent 2 days digging through debris looking for Tante Clara. She'd found her. The letter didn't elaborate on the condition. And then, buried in the 3rd paragraph like a knife between ribs, "Your brother Klaus is taken by the Russians. We received word from his commanding officer. Somewhere in Poland. Pray for him, Liebchen. Pray harder than you have ever prayed." The tree bark pressed rough against Greta's spine. Around her, the Texas afternoon hummed with insects and distant voices. Someone laughed, actually laughed, at something another prisoner had said. The cognitive dissonance was so profound it felt almost physical, a splitting sensation as if her mind were trying to occupy 2 contradictory realities simultaneously. Here, running water, medical care, 3 meals daily, even a small library where she could check out books in German. There, her brother in a Soviet labor camp where German prisoners died at rates no one would officially acknowledge but everyone privately knew. Inside the barracks, Anna sat on her bunk, letters spread across her knees, tears running silently down her face. Her father had died in January. Heart attack while clearing rubble, probably brought on by malnutrition and stress, though the letter from her mother didn't use those words. It spoke instead of him, going to sleep and finding peace, the euphemisms of a population that had grown too exhausted for honest grief. Her brother, the one in the photograph, was fighting on the Eastern Front. No word from him in 3 months. Her mother's letter ended with a question that gutted in its simplicity. "Are you eating, Anna? Please tell me you are eating." Marta received nothing. Her family was in Dresden. No one needed to say anything else. Dresden had been razed in February, firestormed into oblivion, and the death toll remained uncertain except in its magnitude. She sat very still, that Goethe volume open in her lap, not reading, just staring at words that had lost whatever meaning they once carried. What good was poetry when the city that produced it had been reduced to ash and scorched stone? The psychological fracture deepened over the following weeks as more letters arrived, each one a documentary of civilizational collapse. Liesel learned her husband had died at Stalingrad, the news 2 years late, lost in the chaos of retreat and defeat. Frau Kirchner's son had been captured by the Soviets near Königsberg. The letter from her daughter-in-law was brief. "He is gone, but we do not know where. They march them east. No one returns." The comparison was unavoidable, corrosive. At night, lying in beds that were almost comfortable, stomachs full of food that was monotonous but sufficient, the women confronted an arithmetic of suffering that demolished whatever certainty they'd carried into captivity. Soviet camps worked German prisoners to death in mines and forests, fed them starvation rations, treated them as subhuman resources to be consumed and discarded. Here, the Americans followed Geneva Convention protocols with bureaucratic precision. Here, they received mail and medical care. Here, they were even offered educational classes, English lessons, occupational training, things meant to prepare them for a future that assumed they had one. The guilt arrived gradually, then all at once. Greta found herself unable to sleep, plagued by the image of Klaus she couldn't verify or dispel. Her brother in some frozen Siberian wasteland, starving, brutalized, dying by degrees while she enjoyed the protection of laws that Germans themselves had violated across the Eastern Front. The propaganda had promised that American captivity meant degradation and death. It had lied. But what if the propaganda about Soviet brutality was true? What if the one thing they'd been told that actually reflected reality was the thing happening to German men while German women sat in relative comfort behind American wire? "It's not fair," Anna whispered one night, voice small in the darkness. "None of this is fair." No one answered because there was no answer. Fairness had abandoned this war long before any of them had been swept into its machinery. What remained was only the slow, grinding recognition that they had served a cause that had promised glory and delivered ash, that had called its enemies monsters while behaving monstrously itself. And the most dangerous thought, the one Greta couldn't suppress no matter how she tried: what if we were always the villains in this story? The war ended in May, but the waiting continued. Victory in Europe meant only that the legal architecture of their captivity had shifted. They were no longer prisoners of an ongoing conflict but remnants of a defeated nation, awaiting repatriation to a country that had ceased to exist in any form they recognized. Summer arrived in Texas with a vengeance, heat that shimmered off the parade ground and made the barracks feel like ovens despite the windows they'd once marveled at. Greta marked days on a makeshift calendar, each X another unit of time suspended between two impossible worlds. The first groups left in August. 30 women, processed and loaded onto trains heading east, then ships heading farther east still, back across the Atlantic they'd crossed in terror. Those who remained gathered at the fence to watch them go, and the farewell was strange, part relief, part dread, part envy for those who would soon know what waited at home, even if that knowing brought only confirmation of loss. Frau Kirchner left in that group, arthritic knee still troublesome, carrying letters to deliver to families whose addresses might no longer exist. She embraced Greta before boarding, whispered something about bearing witness, and then was gone. Letters from the first returnees trickled back through autumn, and they painted a landscape of devastation so complete it seemed almost abstract. Germany had been carved into zones: Soviet, American, British, French, each governed by the victors with varying degrees of mercy or vindictiveness. Berlin was rubble and refugees. Hamburg was skeletal. Munich existed only in patches between craters. The women who'd returned described living in basements and bombed-out apartments, scrounging for food, trading cigarettes for bread, navigating a world where the currency of survival was resourcefulness and moral flexibility. Marta's repatriation came in October. She'd received word that her sister had survived Dresden after all, was living in the Soviet zone, working as a translator for Russian officers. The news should have brought joy but carried only complicated relief. Before leaving, Marta gave Greta her Goethe volume, the one she'd recited from during the Atlantic crossing. "I don't think I can read these anymore," she said quietly. "They belong to a Germany that doesn't exist." She paused. "Maybe one that never did." By December, fewer than 40 women remained. Anna among them. Her mother had written asking her to delay return as long as possible. Hamburg was chaos, food scarce, her mother living in one room of a building that had lost 3 walls. "Stay where there is food and safety," the letter urged. "There is nothing here for you yet." The inversion was complete. The prisoner camp had become sanctuary, and home had become the place too dangerous to return to. Greta received her repatriation orders in February 1946, exactly 1 year after crossing the Atlantic in the Marine Raven's hold. The American officer who processed her paperwork was different from the board sergeant who'd checked them in, younger, less jaded, and he asked in careful German where she would go. Heidelberg, she told him, though she had no idea if her mother still lived at the address she'd memorized. He nodded, stamped her documents, and wished her luck with what seemed like genuine sincerity. She almost thanked him, almost apologized, almost asked him to explain how his country had managed to remain human while hers had abandoned humanity entirely. Instead, she simply took her papers and walked out. The journey back was nothing like the journey across. A proper passenger ship, adequate provisions, even a kind of muted comfort among the returning prisoners who shared the vessel, men and women both, all of them carrying the same haunted knowledge that they were sailing toward devastation. Greta stood at the rail watching the American coast disappear, and the feeling that overwhelmed her wasn't relief or joy but something closer to grief. She was leaving the place that had proven everything she'd believed was a lie. Returning to the place that embodied the consequences of those lies. Heidelberg still stood, partially. The castle remained on its hill, though pockmarked by shells. The river still flowed. But her street was a memory marked by foundations and scattered bricks. Her mother lived now in a single room of a building near the outskirts, aged a decade and 2 years, thinner than Greta had ever seen her. They embraced for a long time, neither speaking, because what was there to say? The apartment smelled of ersatz coffee and damp plaster. They ate a dinner of potato soup so thin it was barely more than water, and Greta thought of the meals in Texas. Adequate, predictable, sufficient, and said nothing. Klaus never came home. Confirmation arrived in 1947. Died in a Soviet labor camp in the Urals, cause listed simply as exhaustion. The word carried volumes. Starved, worked to death, frozen, broken, all of it condensed into clinical bureaucratic language that suggested nothing and implied everything. Greta kept the notification in her mother's Goethe volume, the one Marta had given her, and never spoke of it to anyone. The silence became a pattern. Most of the women never discussed their captivity publicly, never acknowledged the cognitive dissonance that had shattered their understanding of the war they'd served. To admit they'd been treated humanely by the enemy was to concede that the enemy had been more civilized than the cause they'd supported. To speak of American decency was to raise uncomfortable questions about German barbarism. So they kept quiet, carried their knowledge like an internal wound, and watched their country rebuild itself on foundations of selective amnesia. Greta lived another 53 years, died in 1999, having never given an interview, never written a memoir. But she kept that Goethe volume on her shelf, and sometimes, late at night when memory pressed too hard against the present, she would open it and remember. The taste of salt and rust, the clean shock of running water, the terrible mercy of enemies who'd remained human when humanity seemed impossible. Some truths, she learned, are too complicated for simple telling. Some lessons sink so deep they become bone. If you found this journey through history worth your time, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about moments when everything we thought we knew gets challenged. Drop a comment below. What surprised you most about this story? What would you have done in their place? Let's keep this conversation going, because the questions these women faced, about propaganda, truth, and the courage to admit we were wrong, those questions never really go away. They just wait for the next generation to answer them.